And that's the thing, like it's the ticket for everyone to consolidate their own interests. And you just have so many different actors all vying for the same seat.
This is Heena Lotus from Heena Lotus Media. Welcome to my podcast. We are going to be covering Pakistan under potentially a series, depending on how we do and how much we get through, called Pakistan Decoded. The guest speaker today is Haydar. He is phenomenal. He is my go-to when it comes to anything Pakistan.
Thank you so much for having me, Hina. My name is Heather Sayed, and it really does make for like a mess politically. And that's part of the reason why, up until this day in Pakistan, you see a lot of people who they look at the military and they're like, wow, at least you have structure there. At least you have a chain of command. At least you have something that's stable. And so they choose to align themselves with the military because they're like, no,
But
that's
see, I
great.
don't, I, and I disagree when people say that because I've heard the same thing because it's not a chain of command. It's literally just a monopoly, right? There's nothing
Of course.
beyond it.
But it in a country where there's like so much chaos, where there's so much insecurity around the way everything operates, you have, the only stable institution in terms of the fact that it functions, right?
Yeah.
That's enough. That's enough for
No,
it
and
to be a
geo
stable.
and see, I always get into the geopolitics, right? I mean, I'm a geopolitical analyst, that's what I do, but you have to also understand the geopolitics of Pakistan, right? So if you look at the geography, it is surrounded by Iran, Afghanistan, and India, right? So as a byproduct of that, it has to have a very strong military because no matter what angle you're looking at it from, it could very easily be bombed or go to war or have deep ramifications if it didn't have a strong nuclear program or if it didn't have a strong military. Because at this time, it is definitely not allies with India. Let's start with that. Very, very competitive, very, hotbed. You also have the sensitivity around Kashmir. You also have, Iran, which Iran and Pakistan definitely not right now are allies in any capacity. They're actually leaning very differently when it comes to geopolitical alliances. And then Afghanistan and India, actually, we'll get into that later, have built a little bit of an alliance to form a little bit of an aggression against Pakistan. So I think ideally it would be better if Pakistan didn't have such a strong military presence when it comes to its government, especially domestically speaking. But sometimes I feel like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, granted the geography of Pakistan.
For sure. And I think the United States has always understood that Pakistan has a very, very significant position geostrategically, geopolitically in that region. And they understand that it's a gateway to Asia, it's a gateway to the Arab world. It can really be used either way it's put
It's
to.
even a gateway indirectly, if you will, to China, in my
Oh,
opinion.
absolutely.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's why I wanted to do this episode, potentially series, so bad, depending obviously on how this goes, because we always hear about the current events on Pakistan, but geopolitically speaking, it is such a key player for a multitude of different alliances and countries, and people are just not educated on why, right? It's the geography, it's the history, it's the economy, it's the trade deals going on. It has such a rich history and such a big place in politics. And I think one thing that I really appreciate about, doing this interview with you is the fact that we don't necessarily lean one way or the other. The most important thing is to bring knowledge because I think a lot of discourse around Pakistan has to do with like Pakistani nationalism or Pakistani, like people who are very pro, like we should align with the US or we shouldn't or X, Y, and Z. We need to get into the nitty gritty per se of Pakistan because until you understand all these components, you don't understand why it's such a key player in so much of what's going on in the geopolitical world. And I mean, you and I both know this on a personal level. Geopolitics is changing day to day. Like there's times where like people come to me with questions. I'm like, hold on. I didn't even know this happened. I was still in last week's news. Let me catch up before I give any sort of analysis. Geopolitics is just crazy right now. And Pakistan is indirectly or directly part of every story, in my opinion.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy to see because you had such a period where Pakistan really wasn't relevant anymore, and it's which we'll get into. I'm sure it's kind of made itself relevant once again, and they've really positioned themselves on a number of issues in a way where it's inescapable to kind of go through Pakistan or at least engage with it, right? And on the note of what you were just discussing, you had, as far back as the 1950s and the 60s, where Pakistan had a very strong relationship with the US. Again, that coincided with it having a very aggressive authoritarian dictatorship under Ayub Khan, where Pakistan, for that time period, was known as the like premier power in Asia for those 10, 15 years because the United States was so heavily investing in it because they were propping up that regime. And you had all sorts of things. You had the Queen visit at that time. You had Kennedy, and I think it was Jackie Kennedy and JFK. They visited for state visits. The Pakistani general came to Washington, D.C. on a state visit, and they threw him like a parade and a whole ball and stuff. So it's very different, what we even see now, and there's bits of that. But Pakistan was, it was kind of championed and celebrated by the U.S. as far back as then as being this, significant, geographical location and something that they just always needed to kind of be on top of, just in case. Because as you said, China's right there, India's right there, and if we remember at that time of obviously the Soviet Union is just Afghanistan, and then it's the Soviet Union. So the U.S. has always understood that, and increasingly so once
And
again
so
now.
and so has India, because think about it.
Yeah.
You were just discussing the 50s and 60s, and I'm sure we'll get into this in another episode, but then you had the 70s where you had it was literally an ethno-linguistic war, right? And we don't have to get into the details right now, but the Bangladeshi Liberation War was an ethno-linguistic war. That was the origin of it. And India had come in and become allies with, at the time, East Pakistan, right? So it could become its own sovereign nation, not because in my opinion, it cared about it in any capacity, but because then it would fracture and, really disrupt the political and economic infrastructure of Pakistan as a whole. So it went from being, after partition, West and East Pakistan, based on the fact that these two regions were, heavily populated by Muslims, to then being their own two separate entities. And that created a lot of, I guess you could say, structural and infrastructure issues per se, economically and politically in Pakistan as a whole, and that I think really changed the trajectory of the entire country. And I think it was 1972.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that was something that was very significant, and it's very harrowing when you look back at that period of history because it's something that's so heavily ignored and underplayed in, like the Pakistani psyche in terms of, the literal
Pakistan
history.
was on the wrong side of history. I say that as a
It
Pakistani.
was,
Like I hate when people try to tiptoe around this. Pakistan was on the wrong side of history. Did India take full advantage of it? Absolutely. But I
Mhm.
think it's one of those things where India had evil intent, but I'm kind of glad that it intervened because East Pakistan, like I mean, it went through a genocide. There's no way around it. There's
For
no
sure.
way around it. It went through a genocide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, it's the contradictions are so vast because you have Pakistan genociding, people in what became Bangladesh, and then at the very same time, within the next few months after Bangladesh gains independence, you have Pakistan, hosting all these Muslim leaders who came together to kind of, I believe it was called the Lahore Pact, and they met in Lahore. I think it was around 1973, 4, and where they basically, put up this unified front, and they said we're gonna stick together, and this included, Libya, this included Yasser Arafat on behalf of the Palestinians, and a whole host of, the Gulf monarchies, and everyone kind of came together on this understanding that, we're united in this Muslim identity, but at the same time, you were literally, genociding fellow Muslims in Bangladesh. So it's
Over language and ethnicity. That's all it, came down to. So that's the thing. I don't consider myself a Pakistani nationalist. I don't consider myself a nationalist ever. I think when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to history, I think my guiding force is not discussing power. I don't even like looking at it. It's about redistributing humanity. That's how the lens that I look at geopolitics through. So sometimes Pakistan is on the right side of history, sometimes it's on the wrong side of history, sometimes it's the gray area. But I think as Pakistanis that have vested interest in the well-being of Pakistanis that live both in the country overseas as well as the ones that are abroad, we have to hold, and this is not just Pakistanis, we have to hold governments accountable for their history, the geopolitics, foreign affairs, as well as domestic policy. Because until you hold governments accountable, until you hold individuals accountable for what they're doing, they're going to keep doing it. And it's always at the expense of its own people, every single time. Because had we not gone through the liberation war, I think the entire trajectory of Pakistan would have been completely different for a multitude of different levels. And India knew that. They profited off of it. And you know what? I'm not really a big fan of India historically and the things it's done, but I don't blame it in this capacity. And I'm, in a weird way, I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm glad that it did because when genocide is involved, it doesn't matter the reason and why people are getting involved if it's going to save lives. And I know that's a very big, powerful statement, but I will stand by that because human life is important and we always have to remember that.
No, I couldn't have said it any better. And I think that's something that really gets lost, right? Within, as you said, these like national identities. And it's not even national identity, it's the understanding that we have of it, right? Which we create for ourselves. And we kind of understand ourselves through those. And we have such a strong, vested, it's not even a vested interest, it's an affinity towards that identity. And we
Mhm.
hold on to it so strongly. And the denial about the genocide in Bangladesh, in Pakistan today, even, despite, there being a lot more information and a lot more
And evidence
theory
and
about it.
numbers and research and
Yeah.
analysis,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But it's still, something that's very undermined, downplayed. Um, but yeah, I mean, again,
Well,
the
actually,
contra.
if you're watching this episode, please like, subscribe, share with family and friends, especially Pakistani uncles. I think they will definitely get a kick out of this episode. But please put in the comments if you have any questions about Pakistani history, if you want to learn more about the Liberation War or, Pakistan in terms of like foreign affairs. Put it in the comments below. I think, we would love to do future episodes kind of educating people on Pakistan overall, maybe turning Pakistan Decoded into a series because this is the kind of discourse that I think has been so needed in the Pakistani community. And I don't know why I'm the one doing it of all people. I think there's a multitude of people that are way more certified scholars, professors, whatever the case may be. I just haven't seen the initiative taken. So why not on Heena Lotus Media, right? So that all being said and done, I actually wanted to get into the coup of Imran Khan. So let's actually take a huge step back and kind of get into Imran Khan. So we saw the rise of the opposition. And then, I think this kind of brings us to around the time that Ukraine and Russia really got into it, politically speaking. And as a byproduct, Biden at the time had put sanctions on Russia. And Imran Khan obviously got involved with that. And that's what kind of led us, internally as well. But externally, there were issues that led to his coup. So I wanted to kind of get into that subject matter.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, there's a few different variables at play during that time. Um, and everything did come to a head with that visit that Imran Khan made to Russia on the very day that Russia invades Ukraine, right? And there was a bit of a buildup prior to that where the US and the NATO or the EU allies were threatening Russia with all sorts of sanctions, with all sorts of, uh, potential repercussions if it were to take any action against Ukraine, despite there being, a wide-ranging conflict over the last 7, 8 years previously, going all the way back to 2012, 2013, when you had the first bit of excursions taking place. But all that aside, for Imran Khan, that was a very momentous step. And you have to understand, so the backdrop is that inside of Pakistan at that time, there was, that sort of grievances were building to against him and his government. And these were, much of it revolved around the COVID period because there was such, all for, Pakistan was lauded for how well they handled COVID, in terms of the healthcare. But at the same time, the financial ramifications were, very, very bad for that time period. And so he was kind of dealing with that. He was dealing with the financial collapse impending at that time. And
Very high
then
rates of inflation. The job market was, affected. And this was globally speaking. We do have to remember that as a byproduct of COVID, but I think it was really amplified due to a lack of not adhering, that's not the right word. Maybe like um a lack of like policy, right? Or
yeah,
policy and action. I think that's the best way to put it. So
for
due to a
sure.
lack of policy and action and the global ramifications of COVID overall, I think people in Pakistan were suffering tremendously. And that's what kind of led to a lot of the situations that, we're about to talk about.
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, Pakistanis, especially people who are aligned with the opposition, they'll tell you that this was something, that's solely Imran Khan's responsibility, and he kind of chartered Pakistan into this, diabolical mess. But it was more so, again, a long history of different events that kind of led to this moment. And it was something that had been brewing for the last 5, 6 years. But after 2011, as I hinted to earlier, Pakistan has this breakdown with the US in terms of that trust and that understanding, right? And once that starts to take place, once Trump comes into power in 2016, there's a significant cut off on the aid that Pakistan receives. And this means that Pakistan has to go looking for aid or financial aid from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, who had always been very helpful in terms of assisting Pakistan this way,
Well,
but also China as well.
and I wanted to
And
actually take a
yeah,
step back and explain why the sanctions on Russia were so critical to the global South and not just Russia as a whole. Because I think we hear the term sanctions all the time. We see them being placed, even, modern day, it crippled Venezuela. Cuba has those embargoes. I mean, it's on the brink of economic collapse and about to run out of oil. Iran is going through the same thing. Pakistan at this time, was very strong allies also on an economic level with Russia. Russia at the time, I don't know where it is now, but at the time of Biden placing those sanctions on Russia, it was the eighth biggest economy in the world. And the global South heavily depended on it for oil, wheat, a multitude of other things. So I remember at that time, Imran Khan had gone to Moscow and had a meeting with Putin and had bought, if I'm not mistaken, petroleum and wheat at discounted prices. And it was mutually beneficial to both Russia as well as Pakistan, because here Pakistan has this like crippled economy as a byproduct of, various different factors we just discussed. And Russia is not able to do trade with anyone as a byproduct of the sanctions placed on it. This is why I'm very much against sanctions because A, the people domestically will always suffer. It's not the governments, it's the people. But secondly, any economy that was, reliant on the country that's being sanctioned per se, so in this case it was Russia, it cripples those countries too, right? Because a lot of the global south depended on, Russia for X, Y, and Z. They don't care if, Russia's going through war or doing something illegal or not. And, that's obviously conjecture and a completely different debate. But they just need to have like their trade and, various different imports, exports done so their countries can just function. And so for all this to happen, during the time of COVID, countries are already like on the brink of economic collapse and, suffering due to inflation. And here Biden essentially says, hey, no one can trade with Russia, so we can punish them as a byproduct of what they're doing to Ukraine. But here it's like crippling economies even further in the global south. So these sanctions are not just hurting the country at play, but it's a global issue, and that's just something that's not addressed enough.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's nothing but economic warfare. It's a form of terrorism when you think about it. You know, as you suggested, what they're doing in Cuba right now is actively starving millions of people to get a specific political outcome, and that's
But they
bit by
go
bit.
further by saying if you help these countries that were literally starving, then you are on our enemy list. Like that's
Oh
just
yeah,
it's a
oh yeah.
human rights violation through and through. There's no other way to explain it.
For sure. And I think when we think about the sanctions against Russia or, you know, the position that Pakistan found itself in at that point with COVID, with all these, you know, different variables at play, the biggest factor in all of this was China. And China and Pakistan had built a very strong relationship to this point where any sort of, you know, um, assistance economically that Pakistan would need, they were going to China at this point. But with COVID, you know, significantly deterring China's ability to help Pakistan in that way, Pakistan found itself in a position where they're like, where do we go? You know, the U.S. has grown more and more isolated from us over the last few years. China is facing its own set of problems, and so Russia presented this, you know, opportunity in that moment, which I think it was like 300,000 tons or whatever it was of weed and all this, these number of barrels of,
And discounted is important because I mean
yeah,
Pakistan got a deal out of it and Russia had to do the deal because it wasn't going to be able to do these trades otherwise, right? So China
because they were both
did both.
desperate. Yeah, yeah, they both found themselves in that position of desperation, right? And so
But
it was
here's
mutually beneficial.
But here's also something really interesting because this gets into the petrodollar. All trade when it comes to oil or petroleum has historically always been done in dollars, right? Regardless of what countries are at play. And that's what keeps the petrodollar really strong. From my understanding, and I had looked at a multitude of sources, this trade specifically was done in rupees and rubles, which undermines the petrodollar. And I think that also adds another interesting layer to what ultimately happened to Imran Khan.
Yeah, so like it wasn't just like the optics that looked really bad in terms of you're getting there the day they're doing the one thing that the whole Western Bloc is crying out for them not to do. So you're directly undermining them and you're making you know, you're acting as if what they're doing and you know, when we see how the perception of Russia's actions against Ukraine have been managed in the Western media. It's been made out to be a war crime. It's been made out to be a very hostile act of, you know, aggression of warfare against an innocent population. And so that was Pakistan or Imran Khan legitimizing Russia's actions as if saying that you doing this is perfectly fine. And from what I understand, the US had communicated that to Imran Khan and his government a number of times in the weeks before. And and we have to be clear about this that the fact that the meeting was actually initially set up months in advance, they were going to have that deal come about. But the expectation from the United States and the EU countries was that Imran Khan would cancel that because I'm sure there were other leaders of other countries who, in the subsequent weeks before the invasion, had also had plans to go to Russia, but they probably canceled. If there was any sort of understandings, any sort of agreements, they were also canceled. But he stood by that and he said, it's irrelevant to me going there, whatever Russia is doing there. We urge diplomacy. We urge them to, you know, not do anything by force. But he
He
stood
was
by the
he was
fact.
looking at it from a Pakistan first, you know
Exactly.
what I mean? Like ideology or perspective per se, that's a better way to put it. But it came off as he was defying the US's
Yeah.
orders to the world, right? And legitimizing the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, because it made it look like, oh, how dare you do this, or
Right,
you're doing this on purpose to kind of, bite
right.
back. And
Yeah.
so that kind of immediately put him in the United States' bad books, even though he was probably already there. But it was something that he also said during that time, which was that this is going to be part of a long-term relationship that we're building with Russia, and it ties into the relationship already present with China, that we're going to kind of build this pact or this block, and kind of, shift away from the sphere of the Western world and towards Russia and China solely. Like we will not need the Western bloc whatsoever. And so that's, I think, where it kind of got worrying for the United States. And
Which
you have to
also
also,
explains why Imran Khan was in the Epstein files as listed as the biggest threat to the Western world and Israel. And, the proof is in the pudding.
for sure, because he had, for whatever his faults were, for whatever, failures he had in his domestic policies, he had this sort of, backbone, and he was actively defiant in terms of it, and he wasn't going to back down from making this stance once he said he's going to do this.
It was
And
very
that,
reminiscent. I have to bring this up, obviously, being into geopolitics. It was very reminiscent of Gaddafi from Libya. It was very reminiscent of Saddam Hussein from Iraq, in my opinion. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, again, those are leaders who also played into that sort of populist narrative, and that's something that he was doing here too. He's like, I talk about breaking away from the West. I talk about, doing away with mental colonization, slavery, or that sort of mindset. This is that in action, right? And so people celebrated that. They said, "Wow, this is incredible!" Right? He's literally taking this step and he's standing by it. Um, and this all so happens to be not too long after the U.S. is forced to leave, like literally leave Afghanistan in humiliation, right? Where they barely get their personnel into planes and helicopters and leave their air bases in
But
Kabul.
we have to explain to the audience how I don't want to say hilarious, that's not the right word, but ironic this was because how long was the war? 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. They had like a 20-year
Yeah,
war.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
2001, 2002 to
yeah, so
2000.
the US had a 20-year war where they basically got rid of the government and then after 20 years of a war, handed the country back to the same government.
It's
No, there's no other way to put it. That's exactly what the foreign policy was.
Yeah, and I mean it was all for us to see, right? We saw the photos of their, the planes literally not even the doors weren't even shut, and they had to get off the tarmac because they were being shot at. So it couldn't have been more of a humiliating defeat. But what Imran Khan does then is he to kind of, I guess, irk the United States. He invites the the Taliban in Afghanistan to kind of um, build a diplomatic relationship. And so I think his government was the first of any kind in the world to send their envoys to Kabul and kind of, just to give them sort of a warm welcome,
And this
despite
adds
every.
on to what we were saying earlier. He had a very Ummah-centric view. He didn't take into account, necessarily like the history or the bloodbaths or, the friction, the economic or political failures, right, between his country and the various different countries in the region. He had an Ummah-centric view. It was literally Naya Pakistan. We're starting with a clean slate and we want to build alliances with the Muslim countries that surround us, and form like a Muslim brotherhood or like unify the Muslim world per se.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically it because he said, this is a country that historically is our neighbor, and we've historically always been set up to be in direct confrontation with them. And so I'm extending a hand, despite who's in charge, whatever the politics and the policies of the Taliban may be, that's not of significance to me. I know they're a neighboring Muslim country, so I'm gonna, have those diplomatic relationships with them, and I don't care for how it's perceived in the Western world. Again, you're referencing the Epstein files and the way people saw this in the United States and in the West was Pakistan basically legitimizing Taliban policies and rule in Afghanistan. Again, 20 years spent, fighting this entity, absolutely decimating an entire country in the name of fighting this entity, and then you leave for them to take power. You leave behind.
But and I'm getting off topic, but this makes me laugh. I mean, it's extremely sad and depressing, but it also makes me laugh because this is how hilarious US foreign policy is. So I think it was Biden at the time. They froze all Afghani assets. Do you remember that? And
Yep,
then they're like, we have to give this to 9/11 victims. Do you remember this?
I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was just like, I think the entire world was like, wait, but Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. Like, what is even going on right now? But yeah, literally, when the US was leaving and, the Taliban was installing itself back as the government after 20 years of, siege and war and being completely destroyed. Biden froze all like the banks, assets, everything that the government had, at the time. And he said, we need to take these funds and give it to 9/11 victims, or families of like 9/11 victims in the US. It made no sense in any capacity. And if I had to summarize US foreign policy by one strategic move, it would be that one because it just makes no sense in any capacity. None.
Like,
None.
yeah, no, for sure. It's like it's just another like complete miscalculation, right? You're misdirecting.
Miscalculation is such a diplomatic word. I don't know if I like it, but we'll take it for what it's worth.
Yeah, no, it's bizarre. But and then I actually remember the fact that before the U.S. Invaded and occupied Afghanistan, the Taliban offered Osama bin Laden to the US 3 times. On 3 separate occasions, they offered to have him transferred to a safe third country and for them to put him on trial or whatever they wanted to do, diplomatically in that country. And they said no, they declined every single time.
But this is so symmetrical to how like everything else I think the US and even like Israel does, right? Or like the Western world as a whole when it comes to foreign policy or, like having some sort of deals with countries in the global south because this reminds me exactly, and I know I'm getting a little off topic, but when after October 7th, how many times did Hamas, the resistance in Gaza, essentially say, we're ready to do a deal. We're ready to release the hostages. We're ready to do X, Y, and Z, whatever you want. And Israel would say no repeatedly and continue to bomb and siege that area. So we always have to remember that when we're talking about US imperialism, when we're talking about Israel, the US, NATO countries as a whole, the colonial bloc, if you will, they are not diplomatic. They don't play fair. They don't play ethical. And whatever they say is the point of why they're doing what they're doing is never in line with their actions. And I think when we're talking about Afghanistan and the US as well as Israel and, the deals that were supposed to be done with Hamas, I think there's a lot of symmetry between the two.
For sure, yeah. I mean, because the objective isn't to negotiate. It isn't, whatever outcome you think they're, fighting for or desire that they desire. It's just the conflict in itself. They want to go to war. They need that war, and so we see that, as you said, Netanyahu in Gaza, he needed that war, or he has all this, political corruption charges that he's going to have to face. What does he do? He delays and delays by constantly, being present and genociding Palestinians in Gaza. It is very unfortunate.
No, for sure. And actually, so this brings me to the next topic. And I'm sure we're going to keep referencing Imran Khan just based on like the complexity of everything. I wanted to now get into the strict geopolitics in the modern world, if you will, surrounding Pakistan. I wanted to get into the relations between Pakistan and India right now. So I know we just had the Pelgam attacks recently. We also were discussing earlier how now the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, has, struck deals with India, and it's kind of forming this resistance against Pakistan under its new administration. I don't think it would have happened under Imran Khan, but I kind of wanted to go into that because I think whenever we're discussing Pakistani or Indian geopolitics, you cannot discuss one without the other. That's just how it works.
Absolutely. I mean, they kind of mirror each other, right? In terms of who's doing what, it's because of the other always. And I think going off the point that I was speaking about previously, kind of setting up how we got here in terms of the kind of the war, the skirmishes that Pakistan and India had last spring. How do we arrive at that point, right? If Imran Khan had been in power, right? If he had stayed in power,
And this is
would
strictly geopolitically speaking, not
yeah, like
domestic policy
yeah,
anymore. This is
yeah.
just geopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to be like, realistic about it, but if you look at the track record in terms of what he was attempting to do and what he had done with, say, Russia, right? With China, with persistently talking about Kashmir, with persistently supporting Palestinian liberation openly as one of maybe the only sole Muslim leader of a Muslim majority country, stating that at public forums,
That has nuclear powers, and I think that's one of the biggest things that we
which makes
also
it
have
very
to bring up.
exactly. And so you have to ask, like, since his ousting, so much of what has happened in Pakistan with Pakistan, that Pakistan has engaged militarily or on the global stage, would those things happen if he was still there? And I don't think so. And I think it starts with what he did with Afghanistan. That was the marker for what his future objectives were, because he extends this hand of warmth and embrace to the Afghanis, and he says, "We're going to, keep cordial relations despite whatever differences we've had in the past." You have to remember that the Pakistani military, which we discussed, is splintered internally and has aspects who are in support of the Taliban, who are friendly with a lot of the Mujahideen, and all these groups, especially within the tribal areas and throughout Pakistan, that are operating literally to kill Pakistanis, as well as in other countries, and I'm sure in India and other places as well, because they're a byproduct of Pakistan's role in facilitating their creation when Pakistan was helping the United States to deter the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. You have all of this, right? And I think that elements within the Pakistani military know that these groups exist. They prop them up, and they know what they're going to do in terms of violence and chaos and creating disorder. And the Pakistani military cannot justify their over overly bloated budget. They can't justify their presence in within the security apparatus that they've built in Pakistan, in terms of the enormous spending that they have to do in terms of buying new military grade weaponry, buying fighter jets, whatever. If they don't have this uh, you know sort of like perennial threat lingering over everyone all the time, of either it's Afghan Taliban associated, of Al Qaeda associated, ISIS associated groups harming and threatening Pakistanis, or India, which, as you said, is such a huge economic power now. It, like, Pakistan pales in comparison by every metric. Like, there, like, you don't even need to compare anything, right? But Pakistan will tell you that India's, or the Pakistani military will tell you that India's sole objective is to destroy Pakistan, to take over Pakistan. And so the Pakistani military functions through this sort of logic that they've created, that constantly justifies their spending, their presence as they exist, because they need that threat. And I think that's why they allow certain things to happen. That's why they look the other way,
And
because
it
it gives.
doesn't help also that we have, BJP, an extension of RSS and Hindutva in power in India, right? And they marginalize
For
and
sure.
oppress not just Muslims, right? But they also, heavily oppress the Sikh community. They heavily oppress the Christian community. They heavily oppress Dalits, which were, previously known as untouchables in the caste system. But there's just heavy, and honestly, they marginalize and oppress anyone who speaks out against the government. I know they say it's a democracy, but they're a democracy in the way that Israel is a democracy. There's a lot of racial, ethnic, and religious subjugation, and the way that the West defines democracy is not the way I think you and I would define democracy. I think that's a very diplomatic way of saying it.
For sure. And on that note, like the way that Imran Khan was handling India, he was very vocal when it came to Kashmir. He was very vocal about, Indian state sanctioned violence against Muslims in India, the repression of rights throughout for Muslims. He was very vocal, but he also constantly extended a hand that diplomatically, when we've done it in the past, we can also do it again in terms of building trust between the two countries again. He constantly talked down any reality in which Pakistan would confront India militarily over Kashmir or on any issue. He didn't want to go there in terms of that being a reality uh, that could take place. And so I I think about how since he was ousted, Pakistan's posturing towards India has significantly altered. You know, there was some sense of, diplomacy before. There was some sense of a warmth that was extended to India from time to time, despite the objections and the critiques that Imran Khan was making, or even, with previous governments, they had even better relations with India, especially economically. But since his ousting, Pakistan has completely shifted, and now they have a complete block in terms of any sort of, relations with India. They've kind of made it a point that okay, India is going to play hardball, we're going to play even harder, and that's kind of what led to the the engagement that they had last
With
spring.
the Pelgam attacks. Yes, correct.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. Again, like it's not out of the question, just as the way that, there's a whole host of terror attacks that take place in Pakistan, especially within Balochistan, that Pakistani military intelligence says is directly, they have direct links, those groups have direct links to Indian funding, to Indian support.
I was reading, and I don't know how accurate this is. You may
Yeah.
know a little bit more. So obviously, there's been a lot of aggression between the Balochi resistance, if you will, and Pakistan's military or government. And the numbers are obviously very high. I was reading unconfirmed sources, so don't take this with a grain of salt. I read that the U.S. has just as much involvement as India. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Balochistan has been like a hotbed for a number of years, if not decades, actually, at this
And
point.
it's a hotbed, not just because we have to remember the Balochi people are an ethnicity, South Asia as a whole, right? It's not one monolith ethnicity. You have Punjabis, you have Sindhis, you have Balochis, you have Bengalis, and then you have them not just in one region, right? You have them kind of
All across.
dispersed around. So Balochis, from my understanding, they have a very big population also in Afghanistan and Iran, as well as Pakistan. And the reason it's important to discuss that is there's a lot of conjecture on the fact that Balochis believe in having their own ethno state, where it would just be parts of Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, parts of Iran. I don't know if there's any other countries involved in that, but they would create their own ethno state, and it's not very different than the Kurds saying they want their own ethno state in the Swana region, or even the concept of Khalistan, where Punjabis on both sides of the border say that they deserve their own piece of land and deserve their own ethno state as well, as a byproduct of oppression from the mother country, if you will. So this concept is very prevalent throughout the Middle East, or excuse me, the Swana region, as well as South Asia. And all I can say is the British knew what they were doing when they created the lines that, form modern day, the Swana region, as well as modern day South Asia. I think they did it on purpose to not give certain regions their own ethno state, or creating a line, between, or right through, like these ethnic hotbeds, if you will, because they knew that it would fracture the economy. They knew it would create a lot of resistance, and they knew that it would create aggression between different countries, because this is a region. I mean, the British studied history. They knew what they were doing. But ethnicity is a very, very big component throughout South Asian history. It's a very big component throughout, Swana region based history. And so to break up these factions between different countries creates a lot of suffering and turmoil. And that suffering and turmoil keeps Pakistan, it keeps India, it keeps Iran, it keeps Afghanistan in a constant state of war amongst each other, in my opinion.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think you put it so well in terms of summarizing that. And like the British, I guess the British, the French, they both had this like incredible ability to be completely clueless, but then also know exactly what they were doing. In
Oh no, they
clueless
knew
in
what they were
terms,
doing. They
no,
put the partition line was right through the heart of Punjab. We
they
know that was on purpose.
Yeah, no, for sure. But like at the same time, they had no concept of, who goes where and what this would. I agree with your point in terms of, there for sure is like a long-term vision where they're like, okay, if we pit these two people together, we'll divide the land in a way where we pit them against each other for sure.
But they
But
didn't
then
know
they
like the intrinsic like history and the
exactly.
culture and like yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's not like they took a course on anthropology and then decided to make the map.
Yeah,
Like
because
get it.
they had dehumanized their subjects to such a point where they're like they don't see them as human, right? So they don't care for their the intricacies of their differences, but they do know enough to be like, okay, if we literally divide the Punjab in this way because like they said it literally made no sense in how they divided the Punjab. Like why would you do that? And it's clear as day because they wanted these newly formed countries to always be at each other's throats. But going back to what you said about the Baloch people, again, you see the same thing. You have obviously significant Baloch population in Pakistan, but also in Iran, and there's to a degree, it's legitimate resistance. The Baloch Liberation Army, I believe, they are a legitimate, resistance faction, and they've basically been resisting the Pakistani military, which has gone into Balochistan for the best part of 20, 30 years now. And again, remember, Balochistan, completely arid land, zero infrastructure, zero development of any sorts. But this is a resource rich, mineral rich province, right? And you also have Gwadar there, which is a port that China has basically made the centerpiece for their CPEC project with Pakistan. And China sees it as the gateway to obviously towards China, to Asia, to the Middle East, the Swana region over there as well. And it's also been an issue for the UAE, who are right across the Strait of Water there, and they're like, we don't want Gwadar, becoming a prosperous port because that affects trade coming through us. And so there's so many conflicting, sort of interests there. And India, obviously, for the same reason, doesn't want Gwadar developing either. And they are probably, I mean, why wouldn't they? They'd be more than happy to cause fracture within Pakistan in terms of, the national makeup if they keep pumping money and weapons into Balochi liberation. But at the same time, it's like the Pakistani military will go into Balochistan. They'll hold all sorts of, military operations, and they'll massacre people, like really long standing, operations. And then so one of the things that they've done is under the guise of fighting terrorism, under the guise of, protecting stability in the province. They've basically kidnapped so many Balochi men and boys who they've basically picked up and disappeared, most likely killed, if not jailed. And this has become a phenomenon in terms of, the disappeared Balochi people. And um, that's something also, by the way, that Imran Khan, early on in his political career, he said that's something that he would, confront and make sure it's like overturned in terms of the policy towards Balochistan and developing Balochistan. But he too wasn't able to, do much to that end. Um, but Balochistan really is a hotbed in terms of, all these different factors in play, where you have the Pakistani military needing to go in there for, long-standing periods. And then you have India, which is, looking to kind of fracture Pakistan through Balochistan. China, which wants to make the port there so that they can, and that port, by the way, would be one of their key entry points for the Belt Road Initiative. Like that, they've earmarked it as such. And so the fact that like this is all happening in one small province is pretty remarkable. And I haven't even got into what's, been discovered there recently and why the US is now taking an interest in there as well.
What have they taken an interest in if we want to at
I
least
mean,
touch on it?
there's apparently there's a lot of like raw rare earth minerals. And if anybody remembers, I'm pretty sure I shared the picture with you when Aslam Munir and Shabazz Sharif visited Trump in the Oval Office during the
Yes,
White
and they
House.
had discussed,
They
okay,
had
yes,
that
yes, I
little
do remember that. I
box.
didn't know it was this
Aslam Munir had
region.
that. Yeah, so Aslam Munir had that little box that he opened like a gift box or something, a display case, and it had
If
like
you're
all
ever having a terrible day, just look at
minerals.
pictures of Asa Munir catering to
And
Trump.
they were like all smiling and laughing and like looking at the wines. Like it couldn't have been more clear. Like, look, this is what we're giving you. And these are the same rare earth minerals, that are developed for use in like AI chips and software. So that's something that will only grow in importance and significance. China, in terms of developing those rare earth minerals, is, I believe, like 20 years ahead of the US. So the US has a lot of catching up to do, but they're actively looking for, any resource-rich area, obviously, to exploit. And I think Pakistan has basically offered that to them. Like there has been a few um, reports about certain American companies that have been given these sort of, first come first sort of basis rights to the minerals. But let's see.
Yeah, no. And actually, since we did get into the topic of, the Balochi people and, the hardships that they've gone through as a byproduct of being fractured through different countries, one of them that we touched on was Iran. Iran is all over the news, for a multitude of reasons. And I would love to get into the relations between Pakistan and Iran. I do want to kind of, set the foundation for this. We have to remember that Pakistan is the only nuclear country in the Muslim world. And Iran, though it is not a nuclear country per se, well, officially, it does have a nuclear program, and it was actually it was put into place with the help of, Pakistanis way back in the day, not, anytime recently. And with everything that it's gone through with JCPOA and the sanctions, and it obviously being the nucleus to, or for the axis of resistance, which of course is protecting or trying to protect Gazans and Palestinians as a whole in their fight against, Israeli interests. There's just a lot at play, and I just love to get into Pakistan's specific relationship with Iran, especially since we're on the verge of war with Iran.
For sure. I think again, going back to Imran Khan, we have to
Well, this is
compare.
this is our Imran Khan episode, so if we don't go back to him, we're doing something
He,
wrong.
he's
That's
our
why
main
that's
reference.
why we spent hours discussing him at the end of the day.
Honestly, yeah. It's, again, the relations between Pakistan and Iran have shifted considerably since he was ousted. He had always warmed to the idea of, establishing far greater economic cooperation with Iran. There was a proposed pipeline, I believe, for the transfer of petroleum and natural gas between Iran and Pakistan, which was supposed to be a very lucrative project. That hasn't come into fruition. I don't think it ever will now. But I think just as from the offset, when you are strengthening relations with China, when you're getting so much closer to China, to the point where Pakistan was,
And
um,
and
uh,
Russia, because you have to
and
remember,
Russia, of course,
Russia and China are not part of the axis of resistance, but they are, you can say political or economic
unofficial,
allies, right?
yeah,
I won't
for
even say unofficial. They have economic, like they're not in it for the ethos per se, but they help because they all have like a common enemy, right? Like
enemy.
the enemy
Yeah.
of my enemy is my friend. They economically and politically um benefit from it. And I guess you can say they're strategic partners. They're strategic partners in the axis of resistance. And this is just conjecture, by the way, so feel free to disagree with me. But I always kind of thought that one of the reasons that Imran Khan was listed in the Epstein files as the biggest threat to Zionism or Israel, and also one of the reasons that he was taken out of power with, help from the US. I do think they did, play a role in it, even if it was majority Pakistani military and domestic per se, is because I believe that if Imran Khan had stayed in power, I think he would have honestly helped Iran build its nuclear program to where it would be a nuclear, it would have nuclear capability officially on paper. Kind of like North Korea in a way. North Korea was told not to have nuclear weapons and they developed them anyways. I think they were kind of afraid that, Iran being the axis of resistance within, or the nucleus of the axis of resistance within the Swana region, having vested interest in protecting Yemen, having vested interest in protecting Lebanon, as well as, Gazans, people in the West Bank, Palestinians as a whole, and resisting U.S. imperialism. Saudi Arabia is a big one. The U.S., Israel, right? The list goes on and on. If Pakistan had helped, if Imran Khan specifically had helped Iran complete building its nuclear program, I think that would have kind of turned it would have turned the access the other way, right? Because right now you have NATO, you have, the United States, you have Israel kind of on one side of the world holding all the power. I think if Iran and Pakistan, both neighboring countries, were nuclear powers, that would have completely shifted everything, into Russia and China's favor as well as the Muslim world.
Undoubtedly, I think that was the fear, right? And again, when we go back to what Imran Khan had alleged when he had this no confidence vote put towards him, he said that he was ousted, as I'm sure our listeners would be aware of, that there was a coded message, a cipher that was sent from the U.S. Foreign Secretary's office to, or sorry, Secretary of State's office to the Pakistani ambassador, the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, and in saying that if Imran Khan is successfully ousted through this no confidence vote that the opposition has put against him, it would bode well for Pakistan when it comes to their IMF loans, when it comes to favorable terms with that, as well as other outcomes that would generally be in favor to Pakistan. And this was something that was like lambasted as a complete conspiracy, as something like a tinfoil hat sort of conspiracy for the longest time, because at one of the first rallies, Imran Khan just like whips out a piece of paper and he's like waving it in the air and he's like, "This is this is my proof. Like I have this cable right here saying that if I am ousted, if we go back on our understanding with Russia, then all will be forgiven." Like these were the words, "All will be forgiven."
Well, may I remind you, not to interrupt you by any means, but we are living in the day and age where conspiracy theorists are now just scholars. So,
Unfortunately,
or fortunately, depending on how you look at
well,
it.
yeah. I mean, yeah. It's truly horrifying. But no, you're right. It's just yeah, it was such a like a brazen, um, you know, idea that the U.S. could do this, even though we have such a such a strong historical record of the States pulling this exact same thing, if not even worse, throughout the third world, right? Throughout the global south with so many different countries. But he alleges this, he's ousted, he's imprisoned, he's had so many, corruption cases, all sorts of things that were cooked up and, put up against him to assure that he stays out of the political participation. Um, and in that time, Pakistan has, as we mentioned, has shifted away from that sort of softer approach in terms of that a realignment with China and Russia, with that alternative bloc, which undoubtedly would have Iran there as well. Because when you look at how things have transpired since October 7th, it's very clear to see who stands where, right? And I'm sure Imran Khan, especially on Iran, would have sided, you know, favorably with them on the basis that they're a neighboring Muslim country. I think that alone would be his only outlook when it came to Iran.
And I think if you have to remember, if Iran became a nuclear and officially a nuclear country, right, and it had that nuclear capability equivalent to, let's say, Pakistan and other countries that have nuclear capability, this would also pose a threat to India because here you have now two Muslim nations that have nuclear capability, right?
Side
Because
by
right
side.
now, with India and Pakistan both being nuclear and the rest of the Muslim world not being nuclear, or at least officially, it kind of creates this symmetrical conflict between the two. So I think if Iran became nuclear, this would actually, in my opinion, be a big threat, not just in terms of like the where the power lies, right? It's really neatly packaged right now, but it would actually, I think, affect Israel and India both in a multitude of ways.
For sure, like we can go back to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who basically kickstarted the Pakistani nuclear program, right? And he does this to him through a man called Abdul Qadir Khan, who was the father of the atomic bomb for Pakistan. But one of the things that he did, they developed it over 20 years, and it's a whole other separate story about how they develop it, all outside of Pakistan. They've basically in fragments they come up with the whole process outside of Pakistan over like 2 decades. But one of the things that he does immediately as part of this process is he shares that information with the North Koreans, with apparently with Libya, but with Iran in particular. And he gave that to Iran on the basis that we're not going to be the only Muslim nuclear power. You should be a nuclear power as well, right? So I can imagine that in terms of Imran Khan's vision, in terms of, that sort of separate nuclear Muslim bloc building, just having another Muslim nuclear power would be astronomical in terms of the threat that it poses to the Western world, to Israel, particularly Iran having nuclear
Well,
weapons,
yeah, I
right?
was gonna say because I think if any country, and I'm biased maybe when I say this, or I think you probably feel the same way. If any country in the GCC had nuclear power, I think that would actually be an asset to the West.
Oh, for
So
sure,
I
for
think
sure.
saying Muslim is very loose, but when you're looking at specific countries, like Yemen, for example, if Yemen became a nuclear power, that would obviously be a big hit to US imperialism and Israel. Same thing, obviously, with Iran. And I think. I think Imran Khan was taken out for a multitude of reasons. I know what we're discussing is theory and conjecture, but I think when all the dots connect, it's usually for a good reason.